Well, good morning and welcome to day two, or day 2.5 if you were here for the Monday night reception. As is often the case on day two, the room is sparser. How was last night? Did everyone have a good time? Excellent. Glad to hear it. Before I get started in introducing our first speaker this morning, first of all, I would like to commence the day by acknowledging our traditional owners and the custodians of the land, and in doing so acknowledge the more than 3,000 generations of Turrbal and Yuggera people who have met, learnt and passed on cultural practices on these land. I also would like to acknowledge their elders and all of our elders, past, present and emerging, who continue to guide us forward in whatever our endeavours may be. For those who I didn't meet yesterday, my name is Kat Matson. I'm the Brisbane's Chief Digital Officer, and once again, ridiculously excited to be moderating this stage for the next few hours as we continue to have our substantive conversations around tech and what it means in our future. And if you are tweeting, Instagramming, Facebooking, LinkedIning, or using whatever other forms of social media that like hashtags, you might want to use the hashtag #HopperDownUnder and see if we can trend again today, or of course the hashtag #WeAreHere. So with that all said, now I get to introduce our first speaker, and it's awkward. It's funny to figure out how to actually say this without sounding, I don't know, gender biased, but it's a pretty genuine pleasure to now, on the second day of a conference, and me emceeing, I think it was about 5 hours of sessions yesterday, I'm about to introduce my first male presenter for the conference. Yes! Welcome, and thank you very much for being willing to be the first male presenter on the, well, at least my stage. I don't know who else was here before. But Brigadier Ian Langford joins us today from the Australian Army. He joined the Army in 1992 and has held a range of command and staff appointments in the Army and Special Forces during his career. Brigadier Langford has served as the Commanding Officer, 2nd Commando Regiment, and has commanded multiple Special Operations Task Groups in Afghanistan, Iraq, and domestic counter-terrorism duties. He tells me that he barracks for both codes of the football. He kind of likes to say that he barracks for Brisbane, but he might have a soft spot for the Rabbitohs. And he's here to talk to us today about robotics and autonomous systems in the Australian Army, which I actually think is one of the most fascinating areas where robotics and autonomous systems can make some huge differences. Would you please welcome to the stage Brigadier Ian Langford.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's been an inspiration, I must say, in the short time that I've been here at Hopper Down Under, just to get a sense of the enthusiasm and the approach that you're all taking to many important topics, which includes our future workforce, the impacts of emerging technology as it relates not only to society, but in my case, the military and the international environment, and also to be allowed to be part of a broader conversation, and that is, how do we mobilise our entire demographic? How do we awaken ourselves to the potential of our community as it relates to using them to make our country a better place, and in my context, a safer place? It's important to give you a context this morning, so if I can beg your indulgence, I'm going to show you a 4-minute video. And it's not an army video with tanks. Well, there's a couple of tanks in there, but it's not an army video in the more traditional sense. It's more of a statement or an understanding of the future operating environment. And for my responsibilities in the Army, that's me thinking about how we get our men and women of our armed forces, our whole of government, and indeed our whole of nation are ready for some of the disruptions that are likely to occur in the next 10 to 15 years. So without further ado, I'll show you the video.
We live in an era of increasing competition where the rules-based international order is coming under pressure. We need to meet the challenges of future conflict. We need to prepare for accelerated warfare. Accelerated warfare has presented us with a new operating environment, an operating environment that is crowded, complex, interconnected, technologically advanced, lethal and uncertain. Our response to these challenges must see us become future ready, and this starts with how we prepare for war. Our region is becoming increasingly defined by a changing geopolitical order and operating spectrum. At the same time, the pace of urbanisation and regional competition in littoral environments is bringing its own form of complexity. These trends are a major factor in accelerating the speed and dynamism across diplomatic, informational, economic, and military interactions. The threats in our operating landscape are changing. Adversaries, including violent extremist organisations and state-based threats, can now control and influence across all operating domains of conflict. The advent of rapidly evolving, easily accessible technology offers advantages to both established powers, non-state actors, and individuals. Low-cost swarming technologies and the ability to sense and strike from long range are increasing the vulnerability of major military systems. Future strike capabilities will not just be physical, but digital. They will be executed at the speed of a mouse click. Sophisticated anti-access area denial capabilities will deny opposing militaries the ability to manoeuvre. Military networking will be critical in terms of generating a system capable of cooperative engagement. This will make distributed systems that are smarter and smaller essential to survivability. While the nature of war as a contest of wills is enduring, disruption is rapidly changing war's character. These characteristics include the convergence of big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, and unmanned autonomous systems with precision weaponry. Fused and synthesized information for decision superiority will be an essential battlefield enabler. The test will be to protect this information from disruption and deception. Technology is not the sole answer. Our challenge is to underpin technological change with a joint warfighting philosophy. This philosophy must be linked to future investment, force structure, and logistics transformation to be relevant in a modern operating environment. The reach of sensors and fires means Army must address all domains and comprehensively integrate across them. Space and cyber have not been fully contested in previous wars, and therefore we have limited knowledge for how conflict in these domains will play out in the future. This means our ability to operate in the traditional air, sea, and land domains are at risk of being debilitated from space and cyber. Yet there is also great opportunity in these domains for military advantage. Future conflict is likely to be across domains where networks and integration are the key to generating military power. Our people must be leaders and integrators who contribute to multidisciplinary teams, enabling us to thrive in uncertainty, adapt to change, and generate solutions. We must leverage emerging technology as a potential source of advantage, integrating new technologies within the joint force. We must be physically and cognitively hard to meet the future of war. Future warfare will be fought at the speed of machines, with success belonging to the side who can adapt the fastest, own the time, and best prepare the environment. To meet the challenge of accelerated warfare, we must pull the future towards us, rather than wait for it.
So thanks once again for having us. Again, the aim here is to talk more about the future and less about warfare, but it's clear that our Army, indeed your Army as part of our Defence Force, is at a point now where we need to find our offsets to understand that if we're going to keep pace with the challenges and disruption that comes with advances in technology and the acceleration of change in this global system, which tends to be unfortunately trending from values to interests, then we need robotic systems to help us transform that along with other initiatives. In 2001, the US Army had 263 experimental robots. 3 weeks ago, they had 26,500. They are scaling these systems across much of their capabilities, some of which you saw in the video just now. Grace Hopper is a great example and obviously an inspiration, not only in the context of her life and her research, but its enduring effect. And noting that had a whole of nation aspect to it. It obviously clearly had a military one, whether it be the use of the coding system, that she was innovative and ahead of her time. And it's that sort of spirit and that kind of innovation which Army, and I suspect your organisations, are seeking to acquire as we go forward. But as I said, Army recognises, Defence recognises that the world is changing. Many of the problems that are security in nature going forward will not be solved by the military. They will not be solved by the military. It'll be solved by all of us working, again, consistent with our values and our morals and ethics in ways that leverage technology for a country that is very small in number, has a huge area of responsibility if it'll meet our expectations as part of the global system. And we need, again, that sort of collaboration to be able to leverage technology quickly, and robotics is a classical case in point. Offsets. Our Army needs to understand that, again, in ways that we think about national security, we'll never be bigger than anyone else in the region. And it's not a competition, but the role of the military is to provide, again, that no-fail component of national security, that when war comes, and tragically in our history it does, we as a nation have a response option. In the context of the military being very, very expensive and in many ways unaffordable, we in the Army and the ADF more broadly are always seeking to acquire what I call offsets or asymmetries. It's to find a strength to cover a weakness. It may be possible in the future that we scale robotic systems to be able to mitigate with the fact that we can't afford, nor is it feasible, for us to field armies of millions of people, which in the context of our nation would be clearly inappropriate. So that technology and leveraging it is the offset that we are looking to acquire in collaboration with people such as yourselves going forward. The potentials are obvious. Army has a RAS strategy. We are spending, not Army, but Defence is spending $200 billion out to the end of the next decade recapitalising itself. It comes with initiatives and efforts that are specific to leveraging technology. Robotics is a big part of that. And Army is certainly at the beginning of its journey, but there is no doubt that we see the problem first and foremost, as it applies to this issue and others, as being finding the human capital, unlocking the potential that exists outside of our organisation, because we can't solve this, to be able to understand the opportunities that present in our R&D, in our S&T and in our emerging industries that can help us cope in an environment that again is being seriously disrupted, which you no doubt are aware of. Many of the aspects that we're looking for, not so much in the traditional weaponeering of robotics, which you would understand from popular culture, and which often become the stereotype when we think about, Terminator machines, which is not what Army is specifically focused on. But it comes with metacognition, thinking about how we think about complex problem solving. So the integration of artificial intelligence, the embrace of robotic systems in terms of improving our ability, for example, to saturate an area with unmanned or autonomous systems in lieu of using humans, which are finite and precious, as well as being able to, again, team machines with humans to put people in the right place at the right time to make the right decision. And again, it's an offset that we're seeking, as opposed to the traditional force-on-force nature of the use of the military, which for a country as small as ours is not an option. I talked about mass before. We'll never out-brigade, out-division, out-platoon anyone. As we seek to think about scaling the organisation, as we think about being able to provide responses to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, think about the potential of being able to have long-range robotic unmanned systems that could move hours as opposed to days out to a region in the Southwest Pacific that have been seriously affected by a natural disaster. Think about prototyping what we're seeing right now in places like Rwanda, where blood supplies can be distributed through a robotic system in a way that doesn't require an expensive helicopter or bureaucracy and so forth to reach those remote and distant places. Think about the potential for helping our colleagues in places like Papua New Guinea and the Owen Stanleys, and bringing essential services through those robotic systems in ways that we currently can't afford and are not appropriate. The efficiencies I've talked about, you might be aware in Army that we have a number of trials underway. So again, the enthusiasm in my division and thinking about how to solve problems differently as opposed to the more traditional way is done through this framework that again seeks to leverage these technologies going forward. We have partnerships with Deakin University. We have emerging relationships with other agencies, both in government and beyond, as it relates to some dual purpose initiatives. And again, where there are interests and where they ally, Army is here to support and to help in that context. One of the tragedies of our recent operational experiences has been the wounding of many of our people. Some of those, thanks to the improvised explosive device threat, involve being able to restore movement or allow them to cope with the tragic experience of a permanent disability. And that has meant that in the context of robotics, we seek in many ways much of what the emerging robotic industry in the disability sector is also achieving to do. So power and weight load management, being able to again fully enable the human part of the capability to remove them from the dull, dirty and dangerous work, which we don't see a human necessarily being exposed to anymore, but also in the context of sustaining an injury using robotics and robotic technology that we leverage out of the disability sector to help improve their recovery and adjust to a new normal. Force protection, I've talked about improvised explosive devices. Dull, dirty and dangerous is a good thematic. The capacity to disrupt the lethal aid network, which is sadly likely to proliferate out of those more traditional conflict areas as a terrorist and other non-state actor offset of their own, means that we will need robotics, we will need LiDAR, which is a sophisticated ground penetrating radar. We'll need all those emerging technologies to help us manage with these challenges and keep our people safe. These problems are not new, they are enduring. But again, for Army, we recognise that we can't use the traditional coping mechanisms to solve them, and that the turnkey to this is technology, and robotics plays a significant part of that. You would be pleased to know that we are prototyping and experimenting with many of these systems. Again, let's think less about killer robots, let's think more about the challenge as it relates to scaling a very small force to be able to be in lots more places. The challenge of being able to move load and equipment and deliver aid over complex terrain. And also the use of some of our traditional systems to again be integrated with robots and robotic systems to make our business less expensive to our community. The aim here is to try and be as efficient as we can, to recognise the blood and treasure that's invested in the armed forces often comes at the expense of other parts of society, and therefore it's incumbent on us to use these technologies to reduce that burden as much as we can. The challenges, many of them are familiar with your own industries. Much of it is, again, of dual nature. They're not military specific, but I think you would agree the first step in addressing the opportunities that come from robotic systems is in investing in our human beings, in focusing on our STEM initiatives from the earliest opportunity in relation to encouraging those subjects and their proliferation across our education sector, and to recognise that to have an effective armed forces that can use this technology and reflect its proliferation across the society that it serves, that this kind of cooperation is important going forward. The strategy, again, those of you that are involved in robotics would understand this. We're moving from teleoperated systems right now, using these emerging technologies to hopefully one day move at pace with community to a trusted autonomy paradigm. The ethics of using robotic systems is an issue. I would say it competes with the technological challenges that we face. We need to understand how we will employ these systems on our behalf in a way that's consistent with our values, and you can see there is a lot of work happening in our universities and in other institutions in that regard. But certainly from an Army perspective, what we lack at the moment is the human capital to be able to realise this technology, and any cooperation we can generate amongst ourselves and with our institutions to help your objectives as well as ours would be a welcome first step. Thank you very much. I've got 3 or 4 minutes left for questions. It's been a real pleasure to be here. It's a speed dating form of presentation, and I understand that you've got a big day, but once again, really, really inspirational in the context of what's been organised, what's happening here. I wish you all the best, and ARMY is here to help you not only cope, manage, solve your problems, but also to understand more broadly the technologies and the opportunities that come with this kind of collaboration. So thank you once again. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Brigadier. If you have a question, please pop your hand up while the microphone is coming to you. There's one at the back there. I've got a quick one. Brigadier, you mentioned the challenge of ethics and governance and making sure that the technology and the use of the technology aligns with your values. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
I can. So for those that don't know, the weaponisation of AI and robotics is obviously a concern. It is obviously a concern. In the defensive context, the fact is we've had automated weapons systems in our inventory since the 1960s. So we have threats as it relates to major platforms that are at such speed that humans making a conscious decision to press a button is slower than the incoming munition, and therefore it's not effective. So in a defensive context, we crossed the Rubicon 30 or 40 years ago, albeit unconsciously. The weaponisation in the offensive context in terms of having the temptation to consign the decision to kill human beings to an algorithm is something that we are very consciously focused on. Within our policy framework, there is zero appetite to do that, and that it will be fundamental to how the ADF targets in the context of current policy to always have that decision as a human one, informed by judgments that are non-algorithmic, like emotion, like understanding human irrational behaviour and non-binary systems. So, judgment is a distinctly human contextual response. We'll probably get there one day with an algorithm, but as far as the ADF's concerned, it'll be a human that always makes that decision.
Can't feel better about that. Thank you. Now there was a question right at the back. Yes, I'm hoping you've got the microphone.
I do.
Awesome.
Brigadier, hi. My name's Carly Winkler. I've spent the past 20 years as part of Defence, working to protect our forces. I guess I'd like to ask, given that we're in a Women in Tech conference, are you able to talk about what the Army is doing to make sure that our sisters are part of the future of the Army in a technical space, and what kind of initiatives are running to support that?
Thanks, Carly. And again, it would not be, it would be, appropriate to acknowledge that, all militaries in the context of where they are today are the result of a patriarchal conservative hierarchy. They didn't start at zero, where we can sort of baseline and reflect our community going forward. And the Defence Force is a victim of that in as much as it draws strength from it in the context of how it traditionally approaches warfare. That's not good enough. We've got more than half our demographic that had been disenfranchised through those structures and systems, which in the context of Australia's values and what we think is important is just not appropriate. And so you would be well aware, Carly, that our leadership have signalled the intention and are establishing the structures and are running active interference to ensure that we baseline our force in a way that is gender agnostic, but at the same time recognises that there is currently a gender disparity and it must be fixed. And so, the slow pace of change, which frustrates all of us, is attempting to be remediated by thinking about non-traditional pathways for bringing men and women, I might add, but also specifically women who have skills and ambition into the organisation in non-traditional ways. So, I'd be confident in saying that there is a pathway for everyone in this room into the armed services that values their contribution on their skills, knowledge and attributes, and doesn't consign them to that traditional part of the workforce that, again, that hierarchy sees as less important. So it's a journey. The leadership shares your frustration, but we are planning on and aggressively intending to make progress as we go forward. That's not a satisfactory answer, but I hope that in some way gives you a degree of assurance that we're taking this very seriously. It is not a token effort, that's for sure. Thanks.
Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time, so would you please join me in thanking Brigadier Ian Langford.
Thank you.
How good would it be if every time we had to start something, start our day, start a piece of work, start a meeting, we got a call-in song like that? Like, wouldn't that just make a difference? Whew. Welcome to the Plaza Terrace room. If you are here, I'm assuming it's because you want to hear from our next guest speaker, Lisa Anise, from the Diversity Council of Australia. Lisa Anise is the CEO of the Diversity Council of Australia and was appointed as CEO in June 2014. Lisa leads a team to drive public debate, conduct research and to develop resources to enable diversity in our country. The Australian Financial Review has listed her in the top 100 women of influence, and what I think I like most about the bio that I received is that Lisa has co-authored a book called Chief Execs Unplugged, CEOs Get Real about women in the workplace. I also happen to know that Lisa saw an article this morning about a British woman who married one of her dogs. She kind of gets that, but then she revealed to me that she's got 7 dogs in addition to her husband. So we're not quite sure how the logistics of that one are going to work. Would you please welcome Lisa Anise to the stage?
Hi, thank you. I feel like Katy Perry running up to that. It's not normally the introduction I get at corporate events, but thank you very much for attending this session. I hope you're having a great conference. Yeah, I do get the polyamorous idea of being married to 7 dogs and my husband. I'm sure he'd be into it as well, so maybe that's a conversation for when I get home. So I'm from the Diversity Council Australia. We're a not-for-profit, non-government organisation. We've got about 600 members. Surprisingly, a lot of the traditional organisations in the tech sector are members of the DCA, which shows their commitment to diversity and inclusion, but a lot of the organisations in the gig sector are not, and they're quite resistant to that. So it's a bit of a call out. If you're in one of those organisations, you might just want to consider membership with us because you can access all of our resources. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about inclusion in the tech sector, why it matters, and the fact that I believe your sector has a bit of an inclusion problem. Up on the screen at the moment, there's a bit of a diagram that shows you what makes up an individual's identity. We often hear people being spoken of with reference to their gender or their culture or their age. And it can give you a feeling of us versus them. I mean, there's quite a bit of backlash, for example, in the gender equality space from men who believe that everything's gone too far and it's political correctness gone mad. So this diagram is really good to demonstrate that actually this is about all of us. We all have a gender, an identity that might have a cultural focus, we have a sexual orientation, we have an age, we may or may not have a disability, etc., etc. And all of these different facets of us as individuals inform our worldview. And this is why it makes change in this space so complex, because when you try and increase, say for example, the number of women in leadership, often women are looked at as though they're all the same and they're one homogenous mass. And that's actually really untrue. Has anyone here read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In? Yeah, what did you think? I'm glad to hear it. I often tell people to burn that book, and I'm not a book burner, but what she has basically, the argument she has laid out for her success in tech has benefited her. It does nothing to change the culture to benefit other people. So if you want a one-on-one guide on how to lean into a biased organisation, go for it. But if you actually are genuine about creating a level playing field that creates genuine inclusion, then that's actually, there's no evidence to support her approach. Rather, our research shows that traditional methods of increasing the number of women in leadership tend to benefit straight, cisgendered, Anglo-Celtic women. And anyone who deviates or who has an identity that's a little bit more complex are excluded from that. And in any case, you still have to play by those rules. So inclusion, according to us, and we've done a lot of research, and you can find this on our website, according to our evidence, inclusion consists of 4 things: connection to other human beings in the workplace, operating in an environment where there's respect, so environments free from harassment and discrimination, knowing that what you do has value, so you're able to contribute in the workplace, and having an opportunity to progress. There's no identity difference in the idea of inclusion. It's just that some workplaces are set up so that some people have a natural ability to be able to add value, progress, or operate in an area of respect. A lot of organisations in the tech sector talk about belonging, which is great, but it's only 1/4 of what it means to feel included. Having human connection is important, but if what you do doesn't add value or you're a victim of bullying from another person who doesn't value you, then there is no inclusion. So that's a really important thing to recognise. We run an index every 2 years on how inclusive are Australian workplaces, and what we do know is, contrary to the backlash that you might often hear, most Australians agree that inclusion at work is really important, and they don't want to be in workplaces that are outwardly exclusionary. However, most organisations don't know how to do it. We do know in our research that organisations that rank highly on inclusion are also more likely to deliver excellent customer service, more likely to create innovative solutions to business, more likely to have individuals who are committed and loyal to their workplace. So the business case is really clear. There's no argument against why diversity is good for business. Every piece of research supports the idea that inclusion is good. So even if you have no altruistic intentions, from a purely business perspective, there's, the evidence is really in that inclusion is beneficial for workplaces, and it goes on and on. You can look up our Inclusion at Work Index. A lot of organisations opt in to have this index run internally, and they can have a look at how inclusive they are compared to other organisations. We also know that if you work in an inclusive team, it reduces your risk. So if, as an organisation, you're trying to manage things like harassment and discrimination, focusing on those 4 areas of inclusion actually reduce the rate at which you might likely have situations around harassment, especially sexual harassment. But what we did find is that when we ran the Inclusion Index, the tech sector actually performed really poorly compared to other sectors, really poorly. And that's unfortunate because it's a sector that has a lot of power. It really influences the way individuals live their lives. I mean, tech impacts on all of our lives in the most intimate ways all the time. And yet people who are in the sector report much lower levels of feeling included. That is, feeling connection, feeling as though they're working in a respectful environment, what they do matters, and that they have the opportunity for progression. So where does this all come from? Well, we used to be able to say in organisations that were very traditional that there was a lack of diversity in leadership, and certainly in boardrooms at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, this is sort of what they look like, which, most of us think that's an era of madmen, long gone. More recently, they've looked like this, but in your sector, they look like this. And what we call a brotopia, which means that it's a utopia for everyone as long as you're a guy. And the idea that there's no difference in the patriarchal institution of the tech organisation other than the fact that they wear t-shirts rather than suits, and they still have very, very similar exclusionary rules, even though it's quite quiet. I mean, the fact that I know it's a women in tech conference, but if you really want to change things, the people who need to be at the conference are these people. Otherwise, you will all be leaning into a biased organisation. You'll go back invigorated and excited to create change, but unless these people are there and committed to making change, nothing is actually going to happen. And I would ask you, what is their incentive to do so? You know, with organisations who are listed on the Australian Securities Commission, there's a lot of scrutiny by shareholders, by the regulatory authority. There's a lot of transparency in the way they operate. All these things matter if you want to create change. We know that there are issues that are outside your control to some extent, in that there's an underrepresentation of women studying STEM at university and even at school. Women start to opt out of maths and science by the age of 7. Indeed, I had a Barbie doll, believe this or not, I'm that old, that said maths is hard on the box when I was a little girl. Yeah, I know. I should have kept it. I didn't know I'd have this profession later on. But it would have been really, really useful to have. But what we do know is even when women do really well, they still are seriously underrepresented in their industry. Even when they perform well in their STEM professions, they still will, for example, only 12% of women in STEM are in the top income bracket, even though about 18% of graduates are female in STEM qualifications at university. Okay, so there's still, even though you've got lower representation, you still have these issues. And often when I challenge someone in your sector around their statistics, because we all know data can be manipulated, and I know that running a research organisation, and they say, oh, 30% of our leadership team is female, or, where I saw Facebook yesterday published, in inverted commas, information around the fact that they're now recruiting more African American people and more women than ever. Where are they employed though? Do they have power in the organisation? Is there a pay gap? Are they subjected to sexual harassment? All these things matter if you want to create genuine inclusion. As you can see, things are changing. Women are more and more entering STEM professions, but more and more they're opting out into more health science related careers, which we know, the top one there, veterinary science, it's the lowest paid of all the STEM careers and happens to be the one most dominated by women. I can give you a really good example of what happens when professions start to get dominated by females. They lose status and they lose power. So when I joined the workplace, there used to still be people called tea ladies who used to walk around offices making cups of tea for people. I don't know if anyone else is old enough to remember that. And the tea lady was paid really poorly, and cups of tea didn't cost very much money to buy. Well, now we have baristas, some bearded hipster. It's actually a profession now, and people are very prepared to pay top dollar for their latte. It's really the tea lady, but it's a guy, and there's more status and better pay. Same thing happened with teachers, same thing happened with general practitioners. When the profession gets populated by women, status falls, pay falls. We value what women do less in the workplace. Now, contrarily, outside the workplace, we tend to value women's work very well, even though it's unpaid, caring and domestic drudgery. And we don't value men's contributions outside the workplace. There is a story here for men, but it's outside the workplace. It's around what kind of a life do you want to lead? Do you want to burn out in your profession? Do you want to have substance abuse, mental health problems, and do you want to burn out in your 50s? There is another side to this, but we are just focusing on the workplace and where women are disadvantaged. But I would argue you could have the reverse conversation outside the workplace around parenting and men's engagement at home and their relationship with their children and their partners. And again, if you are interested in going down that path, our website, we've got a whole lot of research. One report that we did in particular called Engaging Men in Gender Equality, which sets out the argument that men in gender equal relationships are much more likely to be happy, have marriages that last longer, have reduced risk-taking behaviour. it's benefit, benefit, benefit. So, but we are just talking about the workplace here. One of my bugbears with your sector is transparency. And you shine a light into an organisation to highlight where problems are, and people will respond to that because they're uncomfortable around scrutiny. The organisations that operate in your sector really do have an issue with transparency. It's not just around the diversity issue. People will, I'm sure you're talking about data, privacy, paying tax. All of those areas are areas where your sector is criticised. And I think it's important to know that without transparency, it's actually really difficult to hold organisations to account. Facebook can release a report, but if it's a self-selected piece of information, not census data, such as is reported to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, you're not able to make a good judgment as to whether they're presenting themselves in the best possible light or whether they're really holding themselves to account. Are they really practicing what they preach? So I would argue that transparency is something that you should agitate for within your organisations. And I think it's a really important way of creating change or starting to create change. We know there's a tech glass ceiling, which is similar to any other glass ceiling, it's a bit more hidden. We know that women who try to fully contribute in your sector, once they start to demand things like workplace flexibility, they need to opt out of leadership positions because it's not considered consistent with having a career. I would argue that men would benefit as well from having genuine mainstream flexibility as well. But the idea that flexibility means that you need to opt out of a career is ludicrous, because the reality is women are here, children are real, someone needs to, families need to support the raising of children, and we need to adapt to that change. Lots of major organisations in Australia now have an old roles flex type of approach. And if you can't do it in the tech sector, where technology is a massive enabler of flexibility, then what hope do you have in other sectors? We also know that discrimination is quite rife, overt discrimination, but also sexual harassment, which is a form of discrimination. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Pay inequality is another massive area. There is a significant pay gap within your sector. The statistics are there. It widens as you get older, and for women, this will have a massive implication for you in retirement. Most women retire with a lifetime earnings deficit anywhere between $250,000 to $1 million a year. And when you consider the fact that family institutions can break down and that women have a longer life expectancy, it's actually really important for your own health and well-being that pay gap gets closed. Again, what's the incentive for organisations to pay women more? Without transparency and scrutiny, there's very little incentive, okay? So I would argue all of these things are connected. Sexual harassment is rife in your industry. We saw the Google walkouts last year. I still can't believe 40 years after the Sex Discrimination Act has been passed that this is still an issue, but it still is. The Human Rights Commission report that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men have experienced workplace sexual harassment in the last 2 years. It's really alarming statistics, and they're the women who report it, not just the people who experience it. So you don't have to dig too far. Most women have got at least one story. Again, it gets back to inclusion. Respect is one of the pillars of inclusion. Without a respectful work environment, you're not able to create an inclusive work environment. If you want more information on this, we've got a really good myth-busting report, which, sometimes someone will say something like, oh, you can't say or do anything anymore, there's no fun at work anymore. And that's wrong, but you don't know what to say. Well, we've created your perfect argument. We've crafted 8 responses to 8 of the biggest myths that exist around harassment. Things like, it's all gone too far, you can't say or do anything anymore, oh, but they're one of our top performers, oh, people are too sensitive, oh, you can't take a joke. All of those things that we all hear, but we're too exhausted and we don't know how to respond to. At the end of the day, if you want to create a respectful work environment, you do have to address that unconscious harassment and the idea that women just need to toughen up, because really the rules have to change to create genuine inclusion. The other thing that's really alarming in your sector is how few women get access to venture capital funds. So a lot of the gig economy billionaire stories have been successful due to investment. If women don't have access to it, it's very, very difficult to have a female-centric organisation start. And that's another quite a big issue, but probably a whole other conference around that. And attrition. I don't know if anyone's had access to the government's decadal STEM plan. It's very small writing here, but I really recommend you look it up, because this will take you through a whole career trajectory of a female from being born up until retirement, and all the areas all the times in which they opt out of particular career choices for various reasons. They could have been imposed on them. First time, as soon as you hear that a baby's been born, what's your first question? Boy or girl? Our gender is the very first group we identify with, before our family, before our class, before our cultural group. Whether we're a boy or a girl, in a binary world, we know gender's not necessarily binary. But if we just limit it to binary, that is a very important belonging group. So all of the expectations we put on those genders are really important. And again, there's an impact for women in the workplace, but outside the workplace, boys are just as damaged by those narrow expectations of their gender as females. In fact, possibly more, because some of the threats facing young men could even be existential in terms of risk-taking, suicide, substance abuse and mental health issues. Okay, so this is a conversation for everybody. The STEM gender equality paradox, which I think is important to point out, is that in countries where there are few rights for women, they actually have more equal numbers of women participating in STEM subjects at school and at university. I think beneath that is the idea that that's probably getting a qualification in STEM is a legitimate way to get power and money, and that probably is behind a lot of the motivation for that. Whereas in more wealthy economies, we don't have those same drivers because we have more freedom in terms of the liberties we enjoy as women. But I think that's a really interesting paradox, and that tells me it's got nothing to do with merit. Because merit is defined by the group in power, merit is in the eye of the beholder, merit is subjective. Every time you hear, oh, but we only want to promote on merit, ask yourself, what is merit? Because merit is defined in the image of the people who are in charge. Okay, it's not real, it's perceived. If it was real, I'd be really worried about the people who are in politics. Lots of talk, no action. It's my constant frustration with this sector. And it's not to say other sectors don't have lots of talk, no action, but people have been working in that space for a very long time. You know, I don't even know where the headquarters are in Australia of lots of the gig economy organisations. The fact that I can't find a headquarters tells me this secret squirrel stuff really prevents you from holding people to account. Holding you to account in the same way that traditional organisations are held to account by women and by society. That's something to think about. I won't be very popular probably with the leaders in your organisation, but that is all. I do believe they are fundamental reasons why things aren't shifting. I'm running out of time. What works is things that focus on your workplace culture, trying to disrupt your bias, so going back to your workplace and saying, hey, why aren't we more transparent? Why don't we report in a census way rather than self-selecting? How do we boost our relationship capital, and what type of leaders, what sort of attributes do we value in our leaders? Because if we value people with no visible family responsibilities, we're always going to exclude women who tend to be primary carers. And you don't even need to have a family or be pregnant to experience pregnancy discrimination. You just need to look like you're at the age where possibly you could maybe in the next few years be pregnant for people to start making assumptions about you and whether it's worth investing in you. Flexibility, I said it at the beginning, it's a massive enabler of gender equality, but it's also a massive enabler of mental health and wellbeing for both men and women as well. It's a win-win, but it's a complex thing to do. You can't just tinker at the edges. If you want to do it properly, you need to understand how to do it properly. So again, we've got lots of resources available. And the other thing that other industries do is they come together as an industry to call for change. A good example at the moment, I mean, a lot of organisations in the Male Champions of Change group, they don't include tech companies. There might be a couple of traditional tech companies, but the CEOs aren't coming together to call for change like they are in other industries. This is another example. With the call for constitutional recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, some sectors are now coming together calling for that. What happens is the business community stands up and is counted, and people within that sector both respect and understand that that's the right way to go, but it helps create social change as well. We saw this with marriage equality, and we know that it works. So I'll leave it there. I've got 5 minutes for questions, but we are a not-for-profit organisation designed to support members improve their capability in diversity and inclusion. And if anything you heard today interests you and you want to do some work internally, I would really suggest you look at joining the DCA as a member and benefiting from our research, our events and our knowledge programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. We are at time for a break, but I am going to take a couple of questions. So if we've got questions, pop your hand up. We'll get a microphone to you quickly. There's got to be questions. Yes. Oh, beautiful, because the microphone's right there too.
Hi, just over here, Leanne Bond. I'm working with a construction company called Downer as Executive for Diversity and Inclusion. And I would say I've got a highly engaged management team, but they do want to know what to do. One of the issues that I come up against, and I have conversations all the time with some of these myths, is the reporting WGEA. And they get quite disengaged and discouraged because they say it's not like for like, makes them look worse than it really is. Because,
does it really?
Well, what they're saying is we obviously have a huge... we have a lot of young women that don't get paid as much, but they want them to come through, and they're saying
stuff,
the pay equity, they work very hard to have like for like on pay equity. So I suppose, is that real, or should I be pushing back on that? And what do you do? Because I'm working on both. I'm working on making sure that today's pay gaps are not like for like, but I'm also working on promotion and bringing women up the ranks.
Well, pay equity is really complex because part of it is about where women are distributed in an economy, which is the issue that you're coming up against. And then part of it is the fact that 38% of the pay gap is actually active discrimination, identical roles or almost identical roles, and it starts at graduate level. That's a real thing. People think it's not a real thing. It's 38% of the pay gap, and I know that because we commissioned economic modelling around it. But what you're talking about is the the segregation part. Look, it's a real issue. My suggestion is, because you're comparing yourself to others in your industry, that's how the pay gap's always relative. How are you performing in your industry? That's probably a more useful comparison than comparing yourself to a sector where there's less pay inequity because there are more women in leadership. So it's probably useful to help understand what constitutes the gap. And then part of the strategy to close that is to get more women into leadership, because it has real life implications for women when they retire. The largest group of of people experiencing homelessness in Australia, the largest growing group, are now mature age women. So that women retiring in poverty is actually it's a real thing. But I understand what you're saying, so I think it's helpful to distinguish between the two. And to recognise that organisations like Downer, the construction industry, is actually doing a lot of really good work in the sector. And they're not anywhere near the worst performing industry when it comes to the pay gap.
Got time for another question. Just down the front here. So the question is around what are some comebacks that we can use, all of us, because in fact the stalwarts of industry we were grimacing at the same thing. What are your comebacks when people say things like, oh, this is political correctness gone mad?
Okay, so in our sexual harassment mythbusters, that's one of the ones, political correctness gone mad. We've got the line, we've got the response, and then we've got the evidence to support the response, okay? The evidence to show that political correctness hasn't gone mad, because if it had gone mad, there'd be a pay gap in favour of men, all the boardrooms would be dominated by women, you'd have men dying at the hands of their intimate partners at the rate of 1 to 2 men every week in Australia. We know that there's no evidence to support that. But what I would say to people, tell me more. What has political correctness, and I challenge that notion, robbed from you exactly? What is it that you want to say that you can't say anymore? Share it with me. I'm interested. Because if it's the fact that you now have to compete on your merit, I think that's a good thing. Is it the fact that sexist behaviour is now going to be frowned upon? I don't have an issue with that. Often when you really hone in, there's no real response. Most people can't give you an example of reverse sexism. I'd love to see an example of reverse sexism that was actually real and not imagined. Because if it was real, I'd be the first person to say that's not in the interest of equity. So that's just one example. What has political correctness stolen from you exactly?
I love it. On that note, I think we can all practice over the break, practice some, maybe even role play some of those conversations. But also I want to tap into that notion of we do need to work on this collectively and together. And yes, this room is dominated by women today, but how can we collectively change the conversations that are happening back in our workplaces and back in our environments? Yeah. Would you please join me in thanking Lisa? Thank you. So it is time for a morning tea break, and for me, I don't know about you, but that conversation was one of those ones where I got increasingly frustrated and then increasingly inspired by the fact that despite all of that, look at what we have done over the last day and a half. We are here. So as you go to the break, please think about what do you take from this particular conversation? How do you continue this conversation?